we ready? Dear friends and colleagues, thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Nino Evgenidze, an Executive Director of Economic Policy Research Center, and it's my great honor and a pleasure to introduce Mr. Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, the Vice President of the German Marshall Fund and the Director of the Berlin office, the German Marshall Fund as well, and to tribute him express my sincere gratitude, because in these difficult times he's in Georgia together with us, and we know what challenging and what difficult and tragic times we have right now. And thank you so much, Thomas, for this dedication and support. And we all know that whatever it takes, as long as it takes, we stand for freedom and we stand for Ukraine and for Georgia. And thanks a lot again, and I will give the floor to my colleagues from EPRC, Ambassador Gigi Gigiadze, to moderate, and then Thomas is gonna make a presentation on this regard, and we will follow, of course, the Q&A session. And 2 years ago, before pandemic, we translated the Thomas' great book, which I think, in my opinion, is a great book, because it's a really was some kind of prediction that the world needs the West. And all his predictions came true. And thank you so much, again, for your dedication and for the people for whom the values and the freedom and the independence is a most important thing to their life. Thank you so much. Gigi?
Hello, good evening. I would like to kindly ask you to stand up and listen to the national anthem of Ukraine. Thank you very much. Please have a seat. Dear Thomas, once again, thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you for your time. Now we'll give floor to you, and afterwards we'll engage in a discussion, as Nino already mentioned. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Say it's a real pleasure to be here. It's Okay, well, that sounds better, it seems. So I want to, first, I'll start over in one say. It is an absolute pleasure and delight to be here, especially in a tragic time like this. I would have wished the environment would be different, but that's what it is. All the more important to be together today, be able to exchange views in this group of friends here. I want to thank Nino Evgenitsa and her whole team at the Economic Policy Research Center for hosting me and us and for putting on this event. Thank you very much. Also, thank you all for coming. I'm interested to see that so many people have come here for something that is a book on something relatively far away. Anything that's not about the war is far away these days, I'm afraid. So, under current conditions, I think it would be negligent and ignorant of me to talk about a book that has only an indirect connection to the topic of the day. In fact, of course, February 24th changed our lives, changed everything. And so I figured I would do less about this book, but talk a little bit about the current situation as it presents itself from my perspective. And maybe that's also a perspective that some, maybe not all, in Berlin share. Also my country's remarkable response to this aggression is probably worth a word or two. And then I want to connect this current moment to the key theory and the key concept of this book, which I have framed as robust liberalism. So I have to confess, I don't have a perfect frame for this moment in time. Just like many, I'm confused. So I would like to share my confusion with you today. And maybe the best I can offer is a structured confusion. My first point is about the soul searching that is going on in Western Europe and in the transatlantic community, certainly in Berlin, where I'm from. Tough questions are asked and need to be asked. What is it that we did not get? Why did we misread Putin's intentions? And why did we misread them badly? Why, even shortly before the war, did we dismiss US and UK intelligence as alarmist and sometimes as self-interested? Was that appeasement, the sickness of the European disease of the 20th century? Was it denial? Was it disbelief? Was it wishful thinking? Was it a false sense of security? Was it even a sense of superiority? And then there is the question of whether there is a pattern of how we misread and misunderstood Mr. Putin. Why is it that we didn't take his aggressive speech seriously in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference? Why didn't we respond more forcefully to the Georgian War in 2008? Why not in 2014 after the next Crimean invasion? And as Germans, the specific question is about why did we balance the sanctions after 2014 and 2015 with another cooperative project called Nord Stream 2? There is a lot of questions to be asked of this kind. And I understand these questions. I understand that they're being asked and need to be asked here and now. And I don't want to avoid these answers to these questions. In fact, I expect a little bit of an ugly battle around these questions. But I also believe this is not the time. This is not the time, as long as the bombs are falling, for recriminations. This is not the time to point fingers at each other, and I would wish there would be no circular firing squad amongst ourselves on these questions. This is a time to look not at the pattern of our own behavior, but at the pattern of behavior from Russia. That's what we need to look at in this moment of time. And when you do that, we will find that brutality has a precedent, ranging from the Tsarist Russia to the Stalinist Russia to the Putinist Russia. And when you just look at the last 70 years, the incidents that I would like to connect is East Berlin 1953, Budapest 1956, Prague 1968, Gdansk and Warsaw 1981, and then certainly Kiev in 2022. And do we see a pattern here? Of course. There is no place where people will see more of a pattern than in this town. It is the pattern that Russia, and previously the Soviet Union, does not tolerate easily free and democratic states in its neighborhood. But this pattern also makes a mockery of the claim that it was NATO expansion eastward that caused this war. Let's look at that pattern. If there is a root cause to this war, I see it quite in a different location. And it is the tragic failure of Russia to choose and sustain democracy for itself. There were two moments of hope in Russian history. In 1905, with the attempt to reform the Tsarist autocracy, and in 1991, when Boris Yeltsin failed to lead a democratic transition and rather chose to put the state in the hands of a KGB operative. Tempi passati. It seems that such a moment of hope is very unlikely to arrive again soon. So here's my second point. This war is not going well for Vladimir Putin. He has bet the house on this invasion. His gamble, in my opinion, will fail. The question is, how long will it take, and what will the costs be until that happens? I think Mr. Putin is destroying the future of Russia. And even if he wins militarily, he loses. And he loses even if he takes Kiev tomorrow. He loses because the price even of a military victory is going to be prohibitive. And I can see 5 reasons for that. First, the occupation, if it happens, if it ever happens, and we shouldn't assume it does, but if it happens, it's going to be a quagmire. He will have, second reason, he will have a weakened military for years to come. He has proven himself not only to be a nation builder in Ukraine, but he's also proven himself to be a NATO builder. He has strengthened Europe and he has strengthened NATO. He will be isolated internationally and economically. Russia will be a pariah state. Not good for Russia. And fifth point, the likelihood that he will be contested internally is at least growing. Let me go into a little more details on some of these. Taking a country is one thing militarily, but holding it is quite another thing. And the Ukrainians have shown us time and time again, post-1917 and even post-1945, what they're willing and capable to do to fight for their independence when we remember that the Ukrainians fought even during Stalinism. Mr. Putin, I think, fell prey to hubris. The hubris of underestimating his enemy. He actually thinks his enemy doesn't exist as a state, and overestimating his own force. His losses of material are significant, and given the coming international isolation and the economic crisis that is also coming for him, it's going to be very hard for him to replace material over time. He also, his third major misreading of the situation is he underestimated the Western response, the unity, the level of pushback, the depth and the severity of sanctions, and the arms deliveries. In fact, Mr. Putin has over the last 15 years only had successes. His salami tactics worked. He believed that this could actually happen again. This, I think, is how this overestimation and the three assessment mistakes may have happened. And we're now to see how he adapts to this type of misassessments that he didn't have to do so far. Make no mistake, the international sanctions are crippling. It is something that we haven't seen since World War II as an international community, and that includes the economic part and the financial part of the sanctions. It will mean that Russia will be isolated and cut off from finances and technology for years. Talent will leave the country. Russia, as I said, will be a pariah state. The catalyst, of course, will be a catalyst for opposition. Will be another phenomenon to watch. The economic elite is going to be discontent. There's at least the possibility of a palace coup. That we can't exclude that from our considerations. Like all dictators, Putin fears first and foremost his own people. In summary, I do not see a good outcome of this for Putin and his regime. My third point, well, if Putin pays a price, or if he loses this, it doesn't mean the West wins this. Because of the duplicity, because of the scale, because of the brutality, and because of the larger vision behind his aggression, it's simply said, it's a war of recolonization. The West has stepped in forcefully, as opposed to previous interventions. But the West is going to have to pay a price of its own, and not an insignificant price at that, for that stepping in. We're looking at a situation where Russia is looking at default pretty soon. Fitch rating agency downgraded Russia just a couple of days ago and predicted default, I think by April, if I'm not mistaken. And that part of that is for the reason of sanctioning the Russian central bank. Now that, of course, has consequences. It is unlikely that the dictators of this world are going to be investing their reserves in future in the US dollar or in the euro. So it is unlikely that it's going to be an easy path for the euro to become a world reserve currency and for the dollar to remain a world reserve currency. So there is a price to pay. In fact, I would claim you can only do such a massive sanction once. And it was because of the civilizational break of what Mr. Putin did on February 24th. It is in some likelihood that we're going into recession. Inflation is going to be high. Energy prices are already exploding. Food prices are already exploding. There's going to be a question of social stability in many of our Western countries, and that is going to be even more true when and if these sanctions are escalated, as some are talking about. Western Europe had the privilege of having low defense spending. There will be much higher costs for defense spending, and some countries, including my own, have announced significant investments into defense. Also, next point, I can't imagine huge investments post-war without the European Union and the transatlantic community helping Ukraine to rebuild its country. There's going to be a huge investment necessary, including from our countries. Alternatively, of course, Europe might see a weak, poor, unstable, fractured, Russian-controlled Ukraine serving as a buffer zone. That is not a pretty prospect, which is why all these prices are worth paying for stopping Vladimir Putin. And finally, Europe and NATO could end up with a weakened, humiliated, revanchist Russia on its border. It could be an isolated rogue superpower with a crippled conventional military, but an intact nuclear arsenal. We would be switching from dangerous strength to dangerous weakness. Also, not a pretty prospect. We would likely see Russia in such a sort of a Cold War-like scenario. I hesitate to say the word because that's not exactly where we are quite yet. But it could become, Russia could become rather an appendix, a vassal of China, but a vassal state with nuclear arms. Haven't seen that in world history. The international order, the rules-based order, would become from a global, would be reduced to a bounded order, largely as part of those Western countries that choose to follow these rules. A much diminished role, but the only way to uphold the universality of rights. And we're already seeing, and we will be seeing in an accelerated way, deglobalization. We've already seen shortened supply chains. We're moving from free trade to managed trade. Geopolitical risk will enter investment decisions and already has. The search for commodity and raw material independence is on. All of that is a massive change of how we conduct business. In summary, this is not a world that anybody in the West, anybody in Europe chose. But we find ourselves in this world, and we need to pay a relatively high price in order to stop Mr. Putin. But if you asked me where I would want to rather be, would I want to be in Mr. Putin's shoes or would I want to be in Western shoes, I would have a choice to make, and I think that choice is pretty clear. Let me turn to Europe and then to my own country. This war has come as a shock to Europe. Something happened that was unimaginable before. This is Europe's 9/11. It goes to the heart of the system. And the system, so understood, is the post-World War, the post-Cold War order of peaceful coexistence, in which conflicts are settled peacefully and war, large-scale war, is no longer an option. Remember, the European Union is a consequence from World War II. It is started as a peace project. So Mr. Putin, other than bombing places and a whole country, is also bombing a vision, is also attacking a vision for Europe. That is why the response, especially in Europe, is so strong. Now, there's always opportunity in crisis. Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European Union, said Europe has been forged in crisis. So this could be one of these moments. And we see some, not comprehensive, but some indication of that to be the case. The idea that Europe would engage in arms sales was an anathema to Brussels just 2 weeks ago. The first 500 million taken for arms deliveries to Ukraine was taken out of a peace and stabilization fund. The same thing happened last night with another 500 million. Defense spending is the second element of this. Sweden was the last in line to decide to significantly increase their defense budget. The swiftness and the unanimity with which Europe dealt with the refugee problem and solved problems that it hadn't been able to solve in 7 years within one evening was remarkable. In summary, to this point, Europe has united around the rejection of Vladimir Putin's war. And it was then Finance Minister Olaf Scholz, German Finance Minister Scholz, who called the last crisis, the last European crisis, and remember there was something called COVID, a Hamiltonian moment for Europe when for the first time a joint recovery fund was introduced based on common debt, something that especially my country rejected for many years. So the question is Europe going to be able to respond in a creative way, in a comprehensive way to this attack on its founding principles? That gets me to my own country. Germany's course correction. Now everybody reads that this is about defense spending, and yes it is, but it's also about a few other things that get less attention. As the foreign minister said, it is about ending a policy of restraint and replacing it with a policy of alliance responsibility. It's changing a Russia policy, and this would be my words, from appeasing and accommodating Russia to one of isolating and punishing Russia. We will see a changed energy policy, as the Chancellor in his now infamous speech 2 Sundays ago announced, with a medium term, that aim is a medium-term energy independence and a fossil-free energy source. Now the term is making the rounds in Germany, freedom energy or renewables, because it is not just about fossil, it's about freedom. Then, of course, as mentioned, the defense spending. And the final point that goes along with and gets least attention, there is a very close coordination between Germany and the United States and its transatlantic partners on any of these things. All of this comes with a renewed sense of togetherness in the transatlantic alliance and a commitment by the German government to do so. So one would ask, why is Germany having this drastic course correction? Well, because it had the longest way to go. It had, I would say it had most to make up for. And I want to spend a minute on explaining why there was such a long way and such a drastic course correction seen as necessary. You've all heard about the Germans talking about their history, and probably you've heard all too much about it. But I have to say there is some truth to that argument, at least in our debate at home. And it isn't just a war that Germany started in 1930. More with regard to Russia and Ukraine, it was a war of extermination, leaving 20 million people dead. So that there is a policy of restraint, and restraint even in the eye of misdeeds by the other side, does seem to make some sense. And the patience that Germany extended to Russia is only understandable on that background. But reconciliation cannot be an excuse for a war of aggression. And that is exactly the point that was made in that speech, or as a consequence of that speech, I should rather say, that the Chancellor gave. Germans also believed that economic interdependence is an instrument to keep each other not only connected, but as an instrument to prevent war. But it turned out that it was the other way around, that gas is financing Putin's war while we can't wean ourselves off of it, that it was a one-sided dependency and not, as we claimed, an instrument of mutual dependency that would prevent war. This whole system, of course, was built on something that has been destroyed on February 24th, and that is trust. It needed some basic trust that this system would not be challenged, would not be destroyed, but it has. Now we have a whole strategy in ruins. And I'm sure not everybody would agree with the following characterization of German strategy, yet certainly not in Berlin. So I'll say it is my very own, that Germany received security from the United States, gas from Russia, and a market from China. I think that model is dead. So my prediction would be that what we've seen in the first response of the German government is only a beginning of a larger rethink. Now, I want to also ask the question, why did it take us so long to get all of this? There's, of course, a number of theories out there. One that I like is the idea that Germany is a status quo power. In the post-1990 world, Germany had probably its best time in history, in peace and affluence, surrounded by friends. And for the first time, it solved the problem of that Germany's industrial the first time since industrialization, I should say, that Germany solved the problem of its over-industrialization and its neighborhood, that it was too small to run Europe, been tried and tested a couple of times to disastrous results, and too big to be one of many. And this current international order is the first one that keeps our neighbors happy with Germany and Germany happy with our neighbors. So I'd say my country is the ultimate status quo power. There is nothing that could tempt us to change that. That is also why you're very slow in responding to changes that you don't like. And that includes changes in Russia that we don't like. Then there's a second theory out there that goes back to the Israeli politician Abba Eban, who once said, democracies do the right thing after having explored all other options. And it is sort of is more of a principle that is not a German speciality, but a democratic principle that we go the extra mile to keep peace, go the extra mile to negotiate, and only when we really have to change course to a more confrontative and a more confrontational posture. Then there is the third theory that there is a sort of German naivete and romanticism about Russia. I would say that's a theory that only holds true for a portion of the German political elite and certainly only a portion of the German population. And then there is maybe the theory that there is also an element of Western hubris connected to our behavior vis-a-vis Russia. And it is part of a larger, in the context of a larger misreading of Russia that this German behavior is part of. And that gets me to my next point about our misreading of what 1989 actually meant. So allow me to take you back 30 years. Allow me to take you back to Francis Fukuyama's famous dictum of the end of history. We used to make fun of it because it was unrealistic and very simple. Oftentimes he was also misread and misunderstood because it was much more nuanced what he actually wrote in his book. But I think we actually believed in it. We mocked it, but we believed in it. This would be the end of history, that we would be moving towards democratic peace. I think the Charter of Paris from 1990 is the international document that best describes this ambition and this hope. And the democratic peace was on the back of American hegemony, the Washington Consensus, the institutions of the liberal international order. All of that was moving us gradually towards this democratic global peace. Global liberalism, communism is dead. Everybody wants to be like us. We believed in transformation through trade. Trade creates wealth. Wealth facilitates individualism. Individualism brings middle classes about, the desire for freedom, and so forth. Quasi-naturally, we arrive at this point of a global liberalism, and anyone who didn't play by the rules wasn't somebody who was a rule breaker, but it was somebody who didn't get it quite yet, but certainly would get the memo tomorrow. So we would just have to give a little more time, do one more little compromise, and then the Cubans, the North Koreans, and whoever would come around. We never contemplated really the option that there's a different world out there. We believed that history was made in Berlin in 1989 when the wall fell, and that 1989 history was not made in Beijing where the tanks rolled. We thought that was an aberration, and they would course correct. Today, that of course looks different, and the same is true, by the way, for Russia. We believed in the Vladimir Putin that appeared in the German Bundestag in 2001 with a wonderful vision of cooperation in Europe, not in the one that we heard in 2007 or that we found operating in 2008. So my conclusion to all of this is that there was a thinking of liberal determinism, that we thought what we were observing was an inevitable outcome of history, and that the path of history could only take one direction. And a whole generation of our politicians thought that they would have to just administer the inevitable, just administer the path towards democracy. And I would even, in hindsight and looking into the mirror, say, there is something that I would call Western triumphalism. And this triumphalism created overreach. So let me talk a little bit about an alternative concept of how to think about liberalism. This overreach clearly, in my understanding, will need to be trimmed to be realistic. We already have the end of the unilateral moment of the United States. American hegemony as such has ended, and that, amongst many disadvantages, has one advantage. The temptation for liberal overreach has dramatically declined. There is nothing that I would call liberal maximalism anymore. In my book, we should adapt to the times by adapting a humbler version of liberalism that is less ambitious, more skeptical, more tempered. We should replace some of the missionarism that was inherent in our behavior with something that I would call exemplary liberalism that does defend and strongly defend universalism, but it promises less and it can keep more. And it also needs to be robust, as we see in a moment like this. The defense of liberalism needs to, even in a tempered version, needs to be strong. The idea of overreach was that we could bring good to people. We would call that a summum bonum, the best of all worlds. I would be content in claiming that we would prevent a summum malum, an ultimate evil, which is exactly the situation that we find ourselves in today. By the way, I have talked about the book for the last 10 or 15 minutes. I have cut the curve from our current situation to the principles of robust liberalism that is at the heart of this book and the term that I'm trying to introduce in this book. It is based on 4 principles that I want to quickly reiterate: individual freedom and human rights, a commitment to multilateralism, self-restraint, and readiness to defend the core principles. These ideas are not new. I have not invented them. They go back actually into the intellectual world of the Cold War, to Isaiah Berlin and to Judith Sklar. Both of them, by the way, have Baltic roots. Sklar was at Harvard and Isaiah Berlin was in Britain. That's what Arthur Schlesinger once called a fighting faith. There is many continental Europeans that are also intellectually in the school. Hannah Arendt would be one of them. Raymond Aron, Karl Popper, if you want to take a Brit, Dolf Sternberger, Marion Dönhoff, as a couple of Germans who would also follow that school. It seems to me that these are good role models to read, reread, and study to learn something about our current moment. The world needs the West, and the West needs a guiding spirit. And that is what robust liberalism offers. It's tempered, but it is principled, and that is what I believe we need in such challenging times. Now, you will ask me one question. Where is Georgia in all of this? And I know that this will be the question, so I will try and answer, but it is going to be a short answer. First of all, of course, liberalism is something that all of us can embrace. Georgia has over a longer period of time, and it can in the future. But of course, it doesn't change the environment that Georgia finds itself in. And I would say in the current environment, many things are, if I want to be honest, are too early to tell. Obviously, where Georgia finds itself will depend on the outcome of the war. But if you follow the assumptions that I have made in the beginning of my talk, that we will see a weakened and isolated Russia, and that we will see a more cohesive West, then there is even opportunity in this situation for a country like Georgia. You might even see a slight regional rebalancing when you look at Turkey. And with regard to Europe, I can just quote Commission President Ursula von der Leyen when she told Ukraine, you belong to us. That is also true for Moldova and for Georgia. That is the context that we find ourselves in. The problem here is, and here I'm not very satisfied with the way that the European Union is operating. For example, yesterday at the heads of governments meeting, they are following a peacetime bureaucratic logic at a time when we are in a wartime emergency situation. That is what I find so unsatisfying with the European response these days. It is clear that there cannot be a snap accession to the European Union that has to be ratified through 28 different parliaments and has to have conditions as long as the eye can see. Even if you reduce them, you're not going to have what these countries need now. So I believe that we need a set of new instruments to describe the path towards accession, and that we don't have these instruments quite yet. I believe there's opportunity in every crisis, and in that sense, I sure hope that there is opportunity, that Georgians will see some opportunity in this crisis as well. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thomas, please have a seat. And yes, thank you very much for this very in-depth analysis of the current reality in this part, please, of the world. And also you started to introduce your book also partially, which I hope everyone will enjoy to read. I would like to reply about the patterns which you mentioned. I mean, the patterns were there and very much visible beginning since the 2008, because Georgia was the first country where Putin's regime exercised its military aggression, and he was forgiven quite quickly. I mean, the West returned very quickly to the business as usual with him. I would like, before we start our question and answer session, I would like to use this opportunity and also ask you, if you look at today's world, I mean, just a few weeks ago, no one would have imagined that there will be full-fledged war in Europe. There will be war in Ukraine, the unprovoked invasion by Russia in this country, and there will be really less possibility to stop these atrocities which are going on right now in this country, on the one hand. On the other hand, as you correctly mentioned, we see unprecedented unity of the transatlantic allies. We see that unprecedented sanctions imposed against Russia, and which will bear some results in the medium and the long-term period. But my question would be, how do you think, how long will it last, this unity, this tough stance of the Western world? How long can it last, considering this dependency on the Russian energy resources, on this big market, and in general?
Well, what an easy question to start with. What you have seen in the last years is a lot of Western disunity. There were a lot of centrifugal forces. Mr. Putin is one big centripetal force. As long as he's doing what he's doing, I think the threat of Russia would be so significant that the premium on agreeing is going to be much higher than the premium on disagreeing. But that doesn't, of course, mean that you're going to be in 28 countries or what have you, going to be agreeing on every single point. From no-fly zones to MiG exports to, I mean, any number of decisions will have to be taken on a daily basis where we will see some discrepancy, as, by the way, we saw yesterday in Poland and the United States. But that is not the main point. The main point is that we see common purpose and unity overriding as an umbrella above daily differences that we have, that we come together after having had disagreements to agree on the next thing together because of the common purpose. So I'm actually more confident of that for bad reasons. The bad reasons is the brutality of Vladimir Putin that brings us together, and unfortunately that's going to last for a while.
Thank you very much. We hope so. We very much count that it will last long enough to defeat the evil in Russia. You touched upon the German position, German stance, and recent changes. I would like to ask you also, in your recent article on the foreign affairs, you were citing the German historian Fritz Stern and his concept of this five Germanys, and now we're witnessing the emergence of the sixth Germany. Do you think that it has already taken place? Do we see the new Germany in Europe, the new political leadership in Germany, or it's early?
No, every article needs a point. That was a stark point to make. I would say we see the beginning of that, because this decision, momentous as it was, and I was watching it on the computer, I didn't believe my eyes. The straightforward talk that the Chancellor, with which he cleaned off a whole slate of belief sets that we had held dear in that country in one Sunday morning speech. But that is only going to be the beginning, because that decision has many consequences in terms of a national security strategy and in terms of philosophically shifting course that I don't see as guaranteed. In fact, I see some danger of relapse here. There has already been a movement from inside the governing coalition that says, do we really have to spend all these 100 billion on defense? Can't we do some development aid on top from that? Now, the Chancellor has said, no. This is what we set out to do. But it gives you a little bit of a sense that this is not, somebody hasn't turned on a switch and all of a sudden you have a new country. There's a whole process. And once again, Vladimir Putin is an excellent educator in that process.
Thank you very much. I think the expectations in Europe are that Germany should lead, and for a long time already. And let's hope that it will stay that way. I would like to invite the audience and to have questions, and I'll just write down. But don't doubt.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting, thought-provoking presentation. I represent the Center for Russian Studies here in Georgia, and while Ukraine is in our heart, each of us who is here or just in the country, think and pray for Ukraine. At the same time, we have to think constantly about the future of Russia. You outlined certain aspects of possible scenarios. You mentioned possible dependency on China, of future Russia, and at the same time you mentioned that Russia lost opportunities for democratization and hardly in the foreseeable future another opportunity will emerge. But you also talked about possible discontent within the ruling elite, and one would add that possible discontent in the society itself. So once again, how you see in the midterm internal developments in Russia, and what would be, I understand that it's too early to speak about it, but still your personal opinion, what would be the rightful new German strategy towards Russia? I mean, Russia isolated, yes, of course, but still certain policies should be developed vis-à-vis Russia.
Should we collect?
Go ahead. Yes, of course.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have two questions. My first question is about the chapter 8 from your book. It's about the intervention and R2P, responsibility to protect. So what you consider as a prerequisite for a possible military intervention of the West in Ukraine? Do you foresee such a scenario where Putin does such a thing that it's unbearable not to intervene? So this is my first question based on the chapter 8 of your book. Second would be that from your presentation we understood, and of course we know, that the sanctions are heavy burden also on the Western societies and Western economies. So there will be a temptation, we fear, to lift sanctions. Somebody thinks that if the war in Ukraine is over, then people will be eager to talk about the lifting sanctions. So, in your opinion, what might be a precondition for lifting sanctions or restarting a new page with Russia? Thank you.
And maybe one more question, Georgi.
Thank you, Georgi Melashvili, the Europe-Georgia Institute. So during your speech, which was extremely interesting and enlightening in some aspects, I noticed 2 points which I would love you to elaborate a little bit more on it. The first one is you mentioned about Russia during Yeltsin, which is sort of delusionally considered a more democratic, more positive Russia than we have under Putin now. Unfortunately, I think we are forgetting about Chechnya, we're forgetting about Abkhazia in Georgia, and we're forgetting about Tskhinvali regions. All these problems were done under Yeltsin's Russia, and we're witnessing that lots of different ways that were repeated. For example, in Crimea, those soldiers without flags, those military vehicles without identifications, they were all tested in Abkhazia, and they were not replied. The West simply didn't notice it. So, in your opinion, should we expect that maybe a more democratized new Russia, which will hopefully eventually emerge as a result of these sanctions, be a better actor in the world, or there is something wrong with the structure of the system right now, which does not allow or which does not give this country a chance to be a more positive player? That's number one. Second one, you also mentioned some theories in the West how we got to this situation. For example, you mentioned the Germany's sort of responsibility for the actions during the 2 world wars, which seems quite fair, but we're always forgetting that most of the atrocities were not implemented in mainland Russia. Most of those atrocities were implemented in Ukraine. The total war, which was held by the German militaries, it was not, of course we had Stalingrad, we had Leningrad, but the worst atrocities were committed as a territory of Ukraine. So sort of when we're speaking about Germany, maybe we should also note that like twice Germany was responsible for proaction, but this time Germany is also responsible for inaction for these decades with those attempts to appease the wrong guy. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's quite a selection. Let me start with, one second. Let me start with the last question and take it back. I think you're absolutely right. I agree with your point on World War II. Timothy Snyder created the term bloodlands for the region where the German war machine was doing its cruelty. And the idea to many in the German system that you would deliver arms to one decomposition part of the former bloodlands to the other decomposition piece of the former bloodlands seemed unthinkable. To arm Ukraine against Russia. We've got nothing to do with this. Sending more weapons can only do more harm. Weapons don't solve problems, and if weapons are being sent, it's not us who do it, it's others. The problem with that argument is the problem that you mentioned. It does not distinguish between aggressor and victim. And it does not see inaction as a moral problem. And I think what ended this policy were the moral problems with that German proposition. That just keep out of it, just don't do anything, don't get involved. That inaction is a moral problem. That is what ended the policy. So therefore, I guess people have heard your argument. A more democratic Russia. Now, my expectation is not that it's going to be a more democratic Russia. At least it's very hard to foresee how that would come about and how sort of the societal structure and underpinning for liberalism would be and how that would be in place in a short and medium term term in Russia. So therefore, I can see lots of upheaval and Mr. Putin having overplayed his hand, and that would be the elites would come to realize that. But that doesn't mean that it translates into a Russian democracy, but rather it could even translate into something equally ugly, or something more tempered and controlled, but still ugly. So I'm not foreseeing this type of development just because there could be someday, on some occasion, be some version of a palace coup. No, I don't. I do see a big problem for Russia in its own development when and if the professional classes, young people, leave the country en masse. The polling in Russia about the desire to leave the country, especially of anybody below 40, is astronomical. At some point in the past, in the country I come from, they built a wall against that phenomenon. So I think that's what I mean when I say that Mr. Putin is losing Russia's future. And people will, if they can't vote at the voting booth, they will vote with their feet, and they're already doing that. And that then reduces the opportunity and the likelihood of a reformist change in Russia, rather than increases it. So my expectation is rather low and rather bleak with regards to the development of Russia. Then the R2 midterm developments in Russia. Oh, the German strategy vis-a-vis Russia. I think there is, and you can already feel that in the public. You cannot bear these daily pictures of slaughter in the middle of Europe. And the desire to see this ended is growing by the day. I don't know how it can grow because it was there from the beginning, but it seems it's still growing. So the idea that at some point Mr. Putin must be in a position to want to negotiate some outcome is high. Now, I would warn people against that at the current moment, because Mr. Putin has not achieved any of his war games. And since he has not achieved any of his war games, any ceasefire will be used by Putin to resupply and to rebuild his chain of command, his logistics, all of that, to reach his war games. So there's a desire in society for peace, for negotiation, for mediation. But the way I think about this is, I remember Dayton, the Dayton Accord. In the Dayton Accord, it was the Americans who armed the Bosnian Croats and the Bosnian Muslims against the Bosnian Serbs and the Milosevic regime. And only when the scale on the battlefield changed did Mr. Milosevic come to the table, and he said in the opening dinner in Dayton, under the wings of a B-52 in the hangar in Dayton. So it was made very clear to him. You can't even foresee a scenario under which Western and clearly here American power would be able to do that. It's very unclear to me how that can play out. So I'm also not optimistic on any short-term negotiated results. I'm actually very suspicious about anything that Putin agrees to right now.
There was a question about the intervention of the robust.
Yeah. That was a bad question. That was a great one. Because you go back to the responsibility to protect doctrine, and can you actually imagine, that's how at least I interpret your question, can you imagine under a UN principle of responsibility to protect, to actually intervene in a humanitarian disaster in, say, Kyiv? Now, theoretically, you could. The world community has tried this once, and that was the Libyan case. I'm not sure that the Libyan case holds many lessons for the Ukrainian case. The correlation and constellation of power is very different. We're not going to get a UN-mandated intervention as responsibility to protect requires. Remember, at the time in Libya, Russia abstained in order to allow for this. Not sure Russia would abstain on any of that. That gets you to the question that I suspect is behind your question, and you tell me if that's incorrect. Is there any conceivable Western intervention into the war? Into the current war on Ukrainian territory? To that, my answer is no. Because the question of World War III will have to be answered before you answer that question. We're not talking about Libya, we're talking about a nuclear-armed superpower. This is what we're talking about. And the idea to have a no-fly zone, this is NATO entering the war. This is shooting down Russian planes. This is shooting down air defense systems. And actually, some of the air defense systems that cover Ukrainian ground are based in Russia. So you're going to have to intercept there. So nobody can tell me that that is a humanitarian intervention alone. It's going to be an act of war, and it means the entry of NATO into the war, and I do not foresee that happening I don't foresee the circumstances under which that will happen. Now, you might say that it's sort of that it's a double-edged sword when Mr. Biden and Mr. Scholz say we will defend every inch of NATO territory, which means we will not defend any inch of territory outside of NATO. I understand that, but please understand the consequences of that are so grave that no one will contemplate that.
Thank you. The second round, Batu, please.
Thank you, Thomas, for your book and for very honest discussion and the points you made. My question is on Europe, whole, free, and peace. The great concept that really brought unprecedented peace in Europe, as you said, and it's hard to imagine what European security would have been without these enlargement phases. But also all this enlargement happened in a sequence that all of those countries became a NATO member first, and then they became EU member. And there is a certain logic why it happened so. So my question is on NATO, and you just mentioned every inch, this phrase and mantra that we hear a lot, and we learned that every inch of NATO territory is really well defended, and Russia will never dare to step in. But what about every inch of NATO promise that NATO made? 2008 to Georgia and Ukraine particularly.
Thank you. Kaldonika.
Hi, Thomas. Eka Trashilashvili, former Foreign Minister of Georgia. Very nice to see you here in Georgia and Tbilisi. One observation and then a question, perhaps. When it comes to observation in historical terms, to my mind, one of the biggest mistake in 80s back then, 30 years before, was to allow the concept of succession of the Soviet Union to emerge when it comes to Russia. For whatever reasons, there was this concept accepted that the evil empire could have had a successor when it comes to the permanent membership of the UN Security Council, being a nuclear power as it was, and in the meantime, countries like Ukraine, which had much larger nuclear arsenal at the time, was denuclearized with the famous or infamous up to now Bucharest memorandum, giving the guarantees which proved to be ephemeral in current times. So it's not the question as to what happens now during the war, but I would encourage historians, political analysts, while thinking back in retrospective at least, to think about that, how wrong that was at the time for that image of a right to more than you can be as a state that Russia was, as much as any one of us were post-Soviet countries, to emerge as a legitimate concept. And part of what we see as a consequence of now is what happened then for Russia to have retained the claim of a semi-empire, weakened empire, but an empire that had an aspiration to be more than it was, and is now as well, when it comes to economic power, social soft power that be, or pretends to be a creator of the new world when it comes to the 21st century that we are beyond. Now the question as of to now, and I see, and I have to admit, I mean, I come here now as part of evacuees from Ukraine. I've spent more than 5 years now in Ukraine, helping Ukraine to build its own institutions. My old friends and colleagues are back there. And I do have that emotional sort of context, but what I hear now from great friends of Ukraine, including you, and I'm sure of that, including of my own country, the positiveness in the unity that the West has found itself, and we see that, right, in the transatlantic. I have that bad feeling as if there is almost a self-indulgence in it, as if the purpose is achieved, we are now awakened, we are united, and we know what to do when it comes to perseverance vis-a-vis Russia, and you are getting ready for the next Cold War, or long-haul game, so to say, to weaken Russia until Russia will deserve to be weakened, of course, with sanctions that be and readiness to stay united in the long haul. And I don't believe this is sufficient, and I don't believe this is an adequate response to what Russia is doing now. Because what we are missing in this process is that we have that unimaginable moment when a country where West underestimated as well, apparently proved that it did not need any Western values of freedom and liberty and dedication to that to be given to them or supported in them, but then they are ready to fight up until the death, to fight for the principles and values that West is awakening now that it forgot, if we are honest about it, for quite some time. And we do have, beyond the morals, a situation when we don't have a partisan war. We don't have a proxy war. We have a real war when one country, represented in Ukraine, which somehow is not yet seen to be worth enough to fight for any inch of its territory or any life in Ukraine, is ready to fight the common fight that has been unleashed by Russia against all of you, by the way. Ukraine is just a theater of operation. And then doing that with the conventional army. And why I say that? They've proven their capacity to wage a conventional war against an army that you always are afraid to even think about, to be confronted with. And these people are doing that. So why don't we change an approach and have a common purpose in a different way? Not to see this process as a long game, Russia being weakened by sanctions or whatever it can be. In the meantime, Ukraine being slaughtered as a sacrifice to your awakening, but then see it as your opportunity to fight back now Russia in the way that Russia is cracked now already at the latest in the midterm rather than in the long term, because this is a unique historical opportunity of the finalization of desovietization that has never ended when the Soviet Union was dissolved. And Ukrainians are giving you that fora. They are not the buffer zone. Ukraine is now giving a historic opportunity for the evil empire finally to fall. Treat this war as a war of opportunity, not as a danger. Don't get used to the idea of calamity and Iron Dome. Fight this war together with Ukraine. No need on the boots of the ground. Ukrainians are so brave enough that, as Churchill said back then in the war, give them the tools, they will finish your job. Not only their job, but give them the tools for them to finish the job. And I'm afraid that we study, we are analytical people, I don't know, intellectuals, but we never learned the history and then lessons. What I hear now from the West is the same mistake of the late 1930s, basically saying that, okay, if it is not on my territory, I can avoid that. It's not my war. Third World War has already started. You like it or not. Ukraine is a theater of operation. And this is not a war of resistance, it is the war of victory. And let's treat it like that. Let's treat it like that so that we are victorious in this war together, rather than we are ready to suffer the consequences of a long-lasting resistance war, in which, yes, I'm sure West will be again victorious, because Russia is so much screwed right now by its own leadership that it will fragment at some days. But I'm not sure that I will live up to that. I'm not sure that my friends in Ukraine will live up to that. And at the end of the day, to be honest, then I don't care. So make us to care for that by understanding that you care for your own victory. This is be or not to be moment. This is not a theorizing moment. So Russia's future depends on that, but I do care about that as a secondary priority. I do care for perseverance of our civilized world, and it will not last for long until this war is treated as a war of victory. And that's the moment of unity that we might think that will last for a long time. Believe me, if the slaughtering of civilian people in Ukraine will last for long, cynicism about democracy and your own resolve will erode in your own communities. And that's where the Russia will be very much effective to undermine and erode every inch of the territory that you think that you will be defending by not interfering in this conflict in a different way.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have to say I understand where you're coming from and why and how you're making the argument. And when I'm in the context of my own country, I'm trying to make the argument not to the same consequence, but in the same line of argument of why this Ukraine is a theater but not the end of it. We're seeing Austria being threatened by Russia. We're seeing the demand, written demand of security guarantees asked of Sweden and Finland. We don't even need to talk about what the Russian designs on the Baltics. We should look at the draft proposal that Russia has submitted to the US and NATO on December 17th. In that, you will essentially find a proposal on the location of missiles and missile launchers in Europe that will mean replacing the American nuclear umbrella with a Russian nuclear umbrella. And if you're Germany, that does affect you. So we're making that same argument that you have just made. I would say some of us, not all of us, in where I come from, that we should be cautious as to whether Ukraine is the be-all, end-all for Russia. It's a way station on a larger neo-imperial design. That is what we need to be aware of. Now, does that mean you enter the war? I would caution us yet again of the consequence of that decision. That decision is not simply a rerun of the 1930s. That is the 1930s plus nuclear arms. That is the difference. And that, I think, sort of also describes the limits of our historical memory that we can draw from. That is what I think the grave responsibility that our current leaders have on their shoulders these days. So I would caution us here. Batu, that was a great wording. Every inch of NATO promise. What to say? Now, you know full well, and I know that you know that the Bucharest summit's language is created in a sausage making. There is no coherence to that sentence. It didn't make sense then, and it doesn't make sense today. It holds a clear promise, but it holds a clear promise from a tortured path. That is also why it's never been acted on. And I think the outcome of the war, of this war, will also determine the approach to these next steps. I'm not sure that anybody is actively looking at this problem through this framework quite yet, because the problem at hand is in Ukraine and not further steps beyond that. But it is clear, and it is clear in terms of the European Union and of NATO enlargement, that this moment has created a new and a changed attention to this issue. And I would be surprised if this issue would not be on the agenda pretty right on top with whatever settlement is going to happen, if there is a settlement even. So I think it's a little early to ask, but I understand the question.
Thank you very much. I think we're running out of time. To wrap up, I would like to tell you that I think the world now needs the West the most, and I very much hope that everything what is going on right now in our vicinity, in this part of Europe, will finally allow the West to wake up to threats from Russia, and it's taken a lot of praise. Thank you once again for a very interesting discussion. Thank you for your in-depth analysis, and hope to see you next time in Georgia again. Herzlichen Dank.
Herzlichen Dank. Thank you very much to all of you, and your pointed question, including some that have words and sentences that I will take home definitely. Thank you.
And you are also encouraged to take books and journals with you. Thank you.